Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast and videocast. We're joined today by Dr. Joanna Leach, who's Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham. Joanna, thanks very much for joining us today.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? You've had a really fascinating journey through research and where you're working now. I'd love to hear more.
That's kind of you to say it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me, but I lived it. So I actually started in an advertising agency, a below-the-line advertising agency, and worked for a number of years doing that. So I have a little bit of a design bent to what I do, but I would stop very much short of me saying I was a very creative person, because that just isn't true. But I moved from that, had some transferable skills, and I moved from that into some project management around a research project that had launched that was over 5 years on urban sustainability and the 24-hour city as it was then. And that sounded very interesting to me. And so I joined as a project manager. I didn't have any research skills at the time, and worked on that for 4 years, because it was a year in when I joined. And then one thing kind of led to another, and cities and sustainability and livability had become very much in vogue, not just with research councils who were sending the funding through to the universities, but also more generally speaking, it was popular in policy. It was popular and becoming ever so more popular with people as well. So there was then a rolling series of projects that we bid for around the themes of sustainability and livability and cities and urban environments and well-being that became funded, that were funded and successful. And through those, I moved my project manager role into more involvement with the research itself, and eventually started to do the research, become a researcher. Then I did my PhD, and that did that part-time. That was fabulous. I had access to some really great people and resources through the projects that I've been involved with, and got my PhD earlier this year. And now I'm a newly minted doctor, as they say. But I've been at it a long time, though. It's just taken forever. It feels like it anyway. And that's where I am now. So now I'm working on a couple of projects, a lot more about infrastructure and well-being, though, this time. So whereas we had a much more general city systems view of things, some of the in some of the projects I'm working on now, a little bit more around the infrastructures, and not just the infrastructures you might think of, like energy and water, which you think engineers do, and they do, but also a lot of what you might term softer systems and infrastructures, the things that underpin our life, like our schools and our healthcare and our food systems. So all of those sorts of things as well.
Okay, so I'm associating with you, obviously, with the PhD. Mine took forever as well. So kind of by the time I got it, I was like, oh, thank goodness for that. So yeah, so here's to you. I'll raise a glass to you later. So it's really interesting you're saying about infrastructure. I mean, so your main focus now is on making cities sort of more sustainable. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. We're always looking at how things are interconnected. So lots of people will say, what do you think about electric cars? And and that's a very good question, but it's how electric cars and the infrastructures that need to be in place for electric cars and how we use electric cars links in with other things, like where we're going and why we're going there. So that's like, where do we work? Where do we have the opportunity to work? Where do we live? Where can we afford to live? And then more recently, what types of living environments are suitable for our health and our well-being, and that includes our fiscal health, if you will. You can't get away from money worries, or lots of it can't. And just as I suppose a bit of a tangent, really, but I was really interested to read just a few days ago that, as a counterpoint to what we are hearing, which is that city centre dwellers, people who are living in city centres in spaces that were designed where you had little personal outdoor space, but perhaps access to local parks or balconies or maybe even private parks. We're hearing about an exodus. You know, people are trying to sell up and they're trying to move somewhere where they've got control over their outdoor space, because the government is controlling where they can go now, and we're not used to that. And so we need as much control of our own personal space as possible. But as a counterpoint to that, I was reading about co-living. Okay. So co-living is a building that an analogy might be a dormitory. So you have personal rooms, but you have common spaces. So the kitchen area and the eating area are common spaces. Entertainment areas. These are like dormitories for adults. One of them has a cocktail area. So it's, it's very much adult. And you'd think those places might become less popular during a pandemic like COVID-19, but not so. Apparently some places have really, they've been oversubscribed, they've been really popular because people don't want to go through a pandemic alone. And this type of living provides, with some degree of control, a way of having connections to the outside world, having connections to other people, while still being quite high density, to be honest. And high density has been the watchword of sustainability for quite a long time now, and we're having to rethink that quite seriously.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as well, there's a whole psychology of it, isn't it, about people being isolated and not having human touch even. So actually the co-living thing is really interesting, how you go about kind of social distancing in those environments. I suppose you create one big bubble and just hope nobody moves.
Yeah, indeed.
You know? So, obviously this is a journal of biophilic design, so kind of sort of going on from that, really, about people saying about people wanting to have having open spaces or having control over a space that would inspire them, presumably, as well. I mean, I'd love to hear, obviously, because I know you work with Birmingham City Council amongst others, and you've done quite a lot of work with different cities. I mean, how do you think we can bring nature and sort of biophilic design elements or biophilia into cities?
So yeah, very good question. And I want to start my answer with, there's a fabulous initiative called Biophilic Cities. Okay. And if you Google Biophilic Cities, you'll come up with the Biophilic Cities initiative. And they are collecting together, as part of what they do, they're collecting together lots of stories about how cities all over the world, mostly the Western world at the moment, but a growing network, started in America, a growing network of cities that are making a commitment to being biophilic, to increasing nature and the many different things that means for a city and the city scale, which is everything from the individual person up to, millions of people, depending on the size of your city. How you can create a more natural and more connected to nature environment within cities, and not just for well-being. There's obvious links. Well, they're obvious now. They weren't so obvious 10 or 20 years ago to us, but obvious links to increasing our well-being by just being able to see nature, being able to smell fresh air, being able to hear birds sing. These are very, very important to us as people. But cities themselves aren't particularly natural things. They're heavily engineered, heavily shaped spaces, and they're dense. There's lots of one type of creature living in quite close proximity to each other and in a small footprint, and that's human beings, and thus we dominate the space with how we live. So we can't just think about the city becoming natural and the city becoming natureful. We need to think of new ways and of thinking about how we live in high dense areas to make it more synchronous, more complementary to protecting the planet that sustains us, really. And we need to think about where we cast our boundaries. So if we cast it at the political boundary of the city, is that completely fair? Because cities pull in resources from beyond their political boundaries, often called the hinterlands, but those hinterlands can be global. So it's quite a difficult problem to unravel in a sense. It's quite a tricky thing to do because the impact of the city is huge, of any city is huge, beyond its own borders. So how you think more sustainably isn't just within a very specific boundary. But that said, there's loads of fantastically innovative things that are going on, and Birmingham, which is where I work at the University of Birmingham, it's where I work. I haven't lived in Birmingham. I have to hold my hand up and say that I haven't lived there, but I've travelled through it many times. I've been kind of all over the city for a variety of different reasons. And they've made this commitment to being biophilic. They've got actually quite a lot of nature. It's not known. When you think Birmingham, you don't think, oh, green. But actually, it is. If you looked at a Google map, a plan view of it, a satellite map of it, you would see it's really quite green. It's reputed to have more miles of canal than Venice. Yeah. It's got this fantastic canal infrastructure, and the city is using that in canal infrastructure to create walkways and cycleways and access to blue spaces and access to green spaces, because the canals link up green spaces as well, to creating a safe, car-free walking environment across the city, alongside other initiatives they have to be, for use of green energy and green infrastructure. So it doesn't have to be all concrete when you're thinking about, for example, water runoff. We're starting to talk about permeable surfaces, so sidewalks don't have to be impermeable where the water just streaks off them and creates rivers sometimes down sidewalks and roads. It can be permeable, and water can soak through it while still being a hard surface that we can push trolleys on and buggies and wheelchairs and prams and all these things and walk safely on. So green infrastructure, and I'm sure you've heard the term green infrastructure before now, is something that we're seeing more and more in cities where we're actually using reeds and planting and softer green spaces to absorb water and runoff, and so we don't have to pipe it away. We can actually water plants with it, essentially, is what we're doing. But green infrastructure to on roofs to hold the heat in the wintertime and to cool it in the summertime, and to provide that kind of service really basically free. Plus, it's good for the plants. Obviously, it's good for the animals and the insects and so forth. And then it's good for us because we get to look at it, we get to breathe the better air, and we get to see the nature.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I think when you see these new builds and they put a load of concrete and asphalt and all that kind of stuff down, and they put it in the driveway, they kind of put their cars and they dig up their garden and they stick a load of concrete down. You're like, oh no, where they could actually kind of have some really creative sort of runoff, as you say, or in different ways, or have the sluice at the bottom would collect the water, which would then, water the trees or whatever. When they chop the trees down and then all this water runs away, it's kind of, there's a benefit, not just about it being aesthetically pleasing for us. As you say, it cleans it cleans the air, it cleans so many things. And obviously to help us prevent flooding.
It does. I mean, one of the things that always surprises me is that you kind of think, oh, it's just planting some trees. Tree planting is very, very popular, and I love it, don't get me wrong. Yeah. But you think, oh, we'll just plant trees, or oh, we'll just put green roofs in, or green walls. There's issues around where we need to think about a little bit about the future. We need to think, well, if we plant a green wall that relies upon, let's say, some sort of fancy timed watering mechanism to stay alive, what if that breaks? What if the money runs out? What if we can't service it? So we always need to be thinking less complicated. The simple solution still is the best, and there's nothing wrong with a vine like ivy, although I realize it can pull apart buildings. But there's nothing wrong with a green wall that is a vine, that's perfectly viable. It doesn't have to be super fabulous plants. And there's obviously a push to native plants because they support the native wildlife, whereas non-native species, it's not that they're bad in and of themselves, but oftentimes your native insects and wildlife and birds they don't know what to do with that. They're not attracted to that sort of planting. But there's a level of technical expertise that we mustn't forget, and I'm always thrilled to see. So in the Thames, there was an initiative to increase certain types of fish stocks, and what the fish required was knowledge that they needed shallow, cut back spaces in the edges of the river in order to get out of the flow, in order to procreate. But something new, you had to have a knowledge of that particular fish species and how it lived in order to, and all they did was then make these lovely little shallow areas, and boom, big impact. But it does require a bit of technical knowledge.
A bit of knowledge, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. Ask the expert. It's always the same, isn't it? Always ask the expert.
It is. But there's lots that, I don't want to put off people. There's lots that any old bod like me and you can do as well. It isn't, but it's that pairing of the expertise with the lay knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's so many benefits of biophilic and biophilia to us. I mean, you mentioned air quality, and I mean, we spoke when we spoke before. We mentioned that you can create sort of nature corridors where can encourage communities even to get together and to be less isolated, and integration and things. I mean, how are you seeing it? How are you seeing the benefits?
Yeah, no, it's without a doubt things like urban farming, where communities get together and plant up spaces and grow fruit and vegetable, because it's very rewarding. Flowers are very rewarding too, but there's something really quite lovely about growing your own carrots and then eating them. When we spoke about incredible edible Todmorden, which is a particularly famous example here in the UK, in the town of Todmorden, where it's a community initiative. Everyone is unpaid. Everyone is a volunteer. It's tremendously popular, but everyone who's involved is a volunteer. And any space they could get their hands on, and still can get their hands on, where they can grow veg and fruit, they do. And they actively plant for produce, window boxes, roundabouts, you name it, they're busy doing it. But of course it snowballs. It's a massive teaching opportunity. So there's a farm, the little kind of farming community where school kids go and they learn about what it takes to grow crops, what it takes to take care of animals. All these things are rolled in together, and it's as a community, you meet people with similar interests. You meet people with different interests, but you meet your community, your geographically kind of co-located community. But you also share something. There's something really quite fundamental about sharing food. As we meal times to many communities across the world are really important to building families, building communities. We stop, we sit, and we share food together, and it means a lot. It means a lot to share food with people who you've just met or who you'd like to know better. And there's a lot going on in our heads and our hearts as well as in our stomachs, I suppose. But yeah, Incredible Edible Todmorden's a really good example. It's a model that's been reproduced across the UK and has sprouted elsewhere, I think, in the world. I
think it's a really cool.
Yeah, I was going to say else about it.
I think it's a really cool idea. And you were just saying about sharing food. I was thinking when I've been in Africa or in India or whatever, and or if you've been in a place where they don't speak their language. And obviously you do get that in different communities in different parts of the UK and in the West and everywhere else. I mean, anywhere in the world, you still get people that can't speak the language or whatever, different generations. And if you can sit down and share, it's like music, I suppose, but if you can share food with someone, and if you've worked on it together and you've learned from them, I mean, as well, it's also that thing of maybe they plant a different type of food, that you could learn from how they nurture it. And I think, I think it's a beautiful thing. I think, I'm just getting people back to nature. Yeah,
it is. Yeah, and it also builds a sense of ownership for those spaces that actually don't have owners. There are lots of spaces in our towns and our villages and our cities where if you pointed at them and said, whose is that?
Yeah.
You'd be hard pressed to come up with an answer. Whose is the middle of the roundabout? Whose is that
Yeah.
triangle between those three pathways? You know, but it creates a sense of pride and a sense of community spirit about a place. Near to us in so I'm living out in Wales, which I know doesn't sound very urban, but there's a town near to us called Whitland, and it had a mayor of Whitland who I met, and when he came into office, one of the first things he did was he went round the street with a power hose, which isn't terribly sustainable, but what he was doing very quickly was cleaning off the streets. And then he noticed as he was doing it, people would kind of look out their door and, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm cleaning up the streets. And then he'd see a potted plant go out beside the door, you know, and a window basket go up. And suddenly people took ownership and pride of their immediate surroundings. And if you feel like someone's helping you as well in staying on top of what can feel overwhelming, I think uncared for areas of places can feel completely overwhelming and dispiriting.
Yeah.
Not just to people who live or work there, but people who just pass through. And you think, how would you even begin? Well, you can begin small. You can begin by planting carrots.
That's really nice. Yeah. I mean, are there other projects where nature can be used to stimulate well-being in cities, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. One of my favorite examples comes from a city I used to live in San Antonio in Texas.
Oh, really?
And they've repeated it in Austin, where I have visited but not lived, and other places. And so there's a large bat population in Texas, and it's not the kind of bats we get in the UK. In the UK, we get small family units of bats of 4 or 5. In Texas, they do things big. They have communities of 1 million individuals. You know, not kidding. I'm not exaggerating. And so, but there's a reasonable number of bridges in the cities, and if you make the expansion joints on the bridge approximately this far apart, the bats will roost.
Oh.
And so you have bat bridges. There's one bridge, I think it's in San Antonio, and they reckon there's 1 million bats living in it. And at dusk, every day, communities of people, families come out onto the nearby parks, and they watch the sunset, and they watch the bats fly. Just amazing. Just amazing.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. That must be just really completely unique to see.
I think it is, because they form this kind of, you know, when you see birds in a flock of birds in the sky, and they create a shape that is beyond the individuals. They do that, bats, and it's there's a word for it, but I'm afraid it escapes me entirely. But yeah, so that's one of my favorites, because I think it was probably, my guess is, I don't know for sure, my guess is that's something that was discovered by accident. And there's somebody kind of clued in that actually, if you make them this wide, the joints, no, if you make them this narrow, no, but this is just right. A bit like Goldilocks, isn't it? And then you can really sustain a community of, you know, a significant community of bats. And I think there's those sorts of opportunities are, I think, quite inspiring. I think they're quite inspiring, you know. And then we have other fabulous, you know, London has its tree planting policy, and I think New York did the same. So plant 1 million trees, and those again are great learning opportunities. But they're also great, I mean, for just changing the urban landscape. And you look out across it, London is fabulously green. You know, when you walk through London, especially certain parts of it around the I'd say the centre, but that's a huge area too, I do realise. but it's, when people come and visit London, that's one of the things they notice is the number of trees and the amount of wildlife. And the wildlife then adapts. And you can take a view as to whether you think that's a good or a bad thing, but birds sing at a slightly higher pitch because they can be heard over the sound of cars. And I was just reading that pigeons whose feathers trap pollution. So you can use them as a barometer for air pollution, actually. But actually, those feathers are changing. They're changing so they don't do that. And these changes are happening in a very short period of time. They're happening in decades, not in hundreds or thousands of years. So they adapt, we adapt. It's wrong to think, sometimes we think we're making everything adapt and we're not adapting, but cities make us adapt as well. We have to be adaptable to different living conditions. And that's why where Biophilic really comes into play, because it's in adapting with care. Everything has to adapt, but we want to do it with care, and we want to do it with compassion, and we want to do it so our well-being, the well-being of other creatures, and the well-being of the planet are all preserved in some way. They might not be exactly what they were, but they're preserved in some way.
That's really beautiful. As you say, it's, yeah, it is. It's really beautiful how we adapt, but it's all about the well-being of creatures ourselves, and how we all, interconnect and live together and sustain each other. In Birmingham, obviously talking about sustainability, I mean, Birmingham is hailed as a sustainable city. I mean, is there a project that was kind of been close to your heart, or that you've worked on, or that you would like to sort of tell us about?
Yeah, so Birmingham's doing quite a lot, and I've already touched upon, I suppose, the things I would have used first to answer that question around adapting the canal network.
Yeah.
They have connected to that. They have an initiative an aspiration to make the city centre car free, and I know that's not completely unique, but what you have to remember about Birmingham is it was built on the motor car. The city centre had, up until fairly recently, what they called the concrete collar, which was a raised motorway that went round it, that provided a barrier. It provided a physical barrier, and it provided a social and an economic barrier. It was hugely expensive to put up, and then hugely expensive to put down, but Birmingham took it down. They recognized it needed to come down, and they took it down, and they rethought their spaces then. And then, of course, we had financial collapse, and now we've got COVID-19, and Birmingham, which used to be one of the largest city councils in Europe, is less than a third of its size, and it's struggled. In some ways, it's struggled to adapt, but through it all, it's got an ambition to be natureful, to be biophilic, to have high well-being, and to do that whilst trying to be economically successful and socially successful for the businesses and the people who use the city. And I suppose laid onto that is that historically Birmingham always underperforms economically. It's a tough nut to crack for Birmingham. So I'm kind of making it out to be like the poor runt of the litter. But it's when other areas in the UK are doing well, Birmingham is always a little bit of a late bloomer, and here it's leading the way. And so I think it's, for Birmingham, it's that ambition to do this that I think is worth it, and worth mentioning, and worth remembering, and that they're doing what we would expect. They're doing cycleways, they're closing some streets, they're wanting to become car free, and they're selling that. They're redesigning their city centre so that it's got more places that are at a human scale, that are about the size of human beings in a space, not about moving through quickly or fast and loud motor cars. It's about slower pace of life. It's not a slow pace of life, but it's a human pace of life. And it reminds me, places like San Francisco have an initiative called Slow Streets, where some streets are designated slow streets, and they're slowly building up a network, because of course these things have to connect, like you say, with the green corridors. They got to go somewhere. They got to connect certain things. They got to a point A and a point B that is useful is always helpful in getting traction with these. But can we make it so it's just people and bicycles? Can we make it more human? in scale and size and speed. Yeah.
Great. It's been really interesting speaking with you, because I'm getting a completely different take on biophilia, because everybody talks about offices, they talk about homes, they talk about, you know, obviously everything about planting, and you know, obviously I mean I know quite a lot about biophilic design, but it is more than just bringing plants in, it's more than just bringing trees in, it's more than just bringing that, and you've really touched on so many different points here. I mean, just, you know, the bat thing, you know, I mean, you know, just and the sharing of food, and there's sort of like the community aspect, and it's back down to human aspect, and our well-being. And you just said the human pace of life. That's what you said, wasn't it? Human pace of life.
I think so.
About slowing. Yeah, it was very good. I'll have to replay it. It was really good. But I mean, kind of finally, unless there's anything else that you'd like to add, I'd really like to kind of get your take on, if you could paint the world with, you know, the brush of biophilia, the world, what would it look like?
So you very kindly sent me this question ahead of time so I could think about it, and I love the question, partly because it could be answered in so many different ways, and I struggled with it because it's hard to be prescriptive. But then I remembered something I read in a journal fairly recently, and it was about architecture of a cancer establishment, a facility in
Maggie?
Jerusalem.
Is this, oh, it's not Maggie's, it's a different one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a facility in Jerusalem, and it's designed to be reminiscent of a butterfly's wings, and it comes up and it goes out, and it's like it looks to me like it's in wood. I'll be honest, I didn't focus on that part of it, and it looks inspiring. And I thought, when I reflect on that and your question, I think about how important high quality spaces are, inside and outside, and nature is a huge part of that, but it isn't the only part of that. It's about the buildings, it's about the street furniture, it's about the services that are provided through the physical environment. It's about the spaces between things, the spaces between buildings, the spaces between destinations, and how we travel. And if they're high quality, and if they're, to be honest, if they're beautifully designed, which isn't always possible or feasible, then collectively, individually they're pleasurable, but collectively they are satisfying in a way that I think is something that I like to see. You know, that melding of the human built and the natureful environment. So for me, it's about, I would want everywhere to be of a high quality design. I would like it to be beautifully designed. And I would like that to be inclusive. I'm not talking about gentrification here. I'm not talking about we'll move in, you know, a middle to middle upper class, and we'll move out a lower to lower middle class. That's not what it's about. Everywhere should be beautiful to the eyes of the beholders, no matter how different they are, really. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.